Few basics about the Bible that you don't commonly hear about. The Bible is perhaps one of the most important texts in history. Composed of the Old and New Testament, it serves as the primary holy book for all of Christianity. The Hebrew Bible, which is composed primarily of what is the Old Testament to Christians, serves as one of the primary holy texts for the Jews. Both Old and New Testaments also serve a lesser role in Islam, the world's second largest religion. About 4 billion people worldwide look to the Bible as the authentic Word of God. The words and verses in these texts have been translated into pretty much every known language surviving today. And the statements and teachings in the Bible affect the judgments of billions. What Moses or what Jesus reportedly said thousands of years ago very much remains significant to a large portion of humanity, from Texas congressmen to Ugandan priests. It is no stretch of the imagination that the words in the Bible can be a matter of life or death to some across the globe. Therefore, it seems that getting the words, sayings, and statements given in the Bible as accurate as possible is very much important. When I was a kid in my non-denominational Southern church, yes, I was brought up Christian, I was taught the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, or the belief that the Bible is without error or fault in all of its teachings. I was taught that the Bible was the unchanged and preserved Word of God. In essence, it means that the books, verses, and words of the Bible haven't been changed or altered since they were written down around 2,000 years ago for the New Testament texts, such as the Gospels, or even older for the Old Testament books such as Genesis. I always assumed, because nobody told me otherwise, that we had some old physical copies of the Bible written by Moses or Jesus' disciples, or someone of biblical importance, in modern English, mind you, lying around somewhere, that all our modern copies are completely without change or alteration when compared to these ancient original texts. The Holy Book has remained constant since the beginning of time. Every word, every comma, every period has remained the same with the help of God Himself. It was only much later that I learned that in truth, what I was taught in church was somewhat misleading, if not wholly inaccurate, and the actual history of the Bible itself is far more complicated. Few Christians, besides those that go to seminary school, even get a chance to learn about the histories and intricacies surrounding the ancient texts that make up the most important book in human history. The original New Testament was written in Greek, which was then translated into Latin via the Vulgate and/or into English via the Tyndale Bible or King James Bible by later Christian scribes in the Middle Ages and later. This is made even more curious when one acknowledges that Jesus' sayings would have been spoken in Aramaic, the common language in Judea at that time, not Greek, which means our modern Bible is at best a translation of a translation, and in some circumstances a translation of a translation of a translation of what Jesus originally would have said, from Aramaic to Greek to Latin or English. I digress. What if I told you that our modern Bible has been changed, and that the Bible of 2,000 years ago is different than the Bible that survives today? Would you believe me? Well, you don't have to, because this is no secret. Even Christian and Jewish scholars will acknowledge this fact. Again, something you don't typically learn in church is that unlike in my childhood dream, there is not some thousands of years old master copy of the Bible under lock and key in the Vatican or Library of Congress. In truth, the Bible and the books it contains today, the Gospel of Matthew or Exodus, are based on copies upon copies upon copies of more ancient texts until you get to the now lost quote-unquote originals. It may be best to illustrate this concept by example. This is a clear oversimplification of the truth, by the way. It's not really a simple linear path of descent, but you get the idea. The Bible you might find placed in a dirty motel nightstand is a Gideon's Bible, named after a Christian organization that tries to distribute as many copies of this Bible as possible across the world. Now, these Bibles are often in the ESV or English Standard Version, published in 2001. They have been rendered into modern English to best suit a 21st century audience. The ESV is itself a translation of the Revised Standard Version of 1952, which is itself a revision of the American Standard Version of 1901, which is a translation of the English Revised Version of the late 1800s, which is finally a revision of the King James Version published in 1611. The King James Version of the Bible is the granddaddy to pretty much all later English translations. Staying with me so far? So you might be noticing that there is a huge gap between 1611 and 33 AD, when Jesus supposedly died. Where exactly did the King James Bible come from? Well, the King James used several sources for its translation. For the Old Testament, it used a translation into English of the Greek Masoretic texts, or MT, primarily copied, edited, and distributed by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes, between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. The oldest surviving copy of one of these texts dated to around the 9th century. But then again, the 7th and 10th centuries are 700 to 1000 years away from Jesus. Where did these come from? Well, these Masoretic texts are themselves copies based off of a now lost older text and an older one still, until we finally reach the original Old Testament of the Bible, which has been lost to time. A similar thing can be done with the New Testament, where copies of copies of copies, some lost, some surviving, can trace us back to the text written shortly after the time of Jesus. In any case, what you begin to find is that the foundations of our modern Bibles are in truth based off of only a few lines of these copies of the originals. And when you zoom out, there's an entire web of different cousin Bible lines, working parallel to the ones our modern Bibles have used, like the MT line or the Vulgate line, that can be mapped out like a family tree, all of them being able to trace back to the original text created thousands of years ago. For instance, we have the Vulgate, a Latin version of the Bible used in Catholic churches, which shares a common origin text with the MT, but contains unmistakable differences. Archaeology has been of crucial importance to biblical scholarship. For hundreds of years, archaeologists have been uncovering older versions of the Bible, buried in ancient houses or in caves dated all the way back to the 1st century AD and BC. For instance, we have the Codex Venaticus, or B, written in Greek sometime around the 300s AD, and kept in the Vatican Library since at least the 15th century. It is one of the oldest copies of the Bible in its recognizable form. Codex Sinaiticus, written around 330 to 360 AD, is held today in the British Library in London. We have fragmentary documents of Aquila of Sinope's translation of the Bible, written in the 2nd century. Even older copies of individual books as opposed to complete Bibles can be found even further back. Papyrus 66, discovered in Egypt and dated to around 200 AD, is a near-complete codex of the Gospel of John. The famous Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of ancient manuscripts, provide us some of the oldest and extensive copies of the Old Testament. Although all these documents and manuscripts are mere copies of originals, they nonetheless are valuable to us. Scholars have uncovered literally hundreds of different copies of texts from the Bible, and what they have discovered about these texts is that, when compared with one another, say Papyrus 75 with Codex Venaticus, or the MT with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the texts generally read the same, if not near exactly in most places. But in others, they vary. They can be different in minor and even major ways. How do we know the Bible has been changed? These areas of alteration or change between biblical copies are called textual variants. Wikipedia has an entire page dedicated to cataloging the work of biblical scholars and identifying these points of variation. Almost every text we discover there appears to be dozens of differences when it is compared with others. These changes likely occur during copyings of older versions of the text, tracing back to the originals. A monk or scribe would manually and painstakingly copy by hand every word from one document to a newer parchment. For texts as long as the Bible, this could take weeks, if not months, if not a year of dedication. This was the world of publishing books prior to the printing press. Some changes made by scribes are accidental, or a simple use of a different word to convey the same idea. A clear example of this is the New Testament book of Hebrews. According to most manuscripts, chapter 1, verse 3 reads like this: Christ bears all things by the word of his power. However, in Codex Venaticus, the original scribe wrote a slightly different verse with a verb that sounded similar in Greek. Christ manifests all things by the word of his power. A minor difference, but a change nonetheless. A second scribe, centuries later, would read this verse in the newer replicated manuscript and decide to change the word manifests back to the more common reading bears, straight up erasing the word on the document and writing the new one in the blank space. Even later, a third scribe would read the exact same verse on the manuscript, notice the alteration made by his predecessor, and erase bears and change it back to manifests. The scribe then proceeded to put a note written in Greek in the margin, calling the altering scribe an idiot for changing the verse, saying, "Fool and knave, leave the old reading, don't change it." Or, as a different translation puts it, "I kid you not, you look like a cuckoo." You can still see this note in the margin to this day in one of the oldest copies of the Bible. And that was just one word. It illustrates that not only did copying errors and changes exist, but they might have been abundant in the Bible's early days, when there were less qualified scribes to identify such errors. Another example of a scribal mistake can be seen in Luke chapter 12, verse 8 and 9, which typically reads, "Whoever confesses me before humans, the Son of Man will confess before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before humans will deny before the angels of God." However, in our oldest papyrus manuscript of this passage, all of verse 9 is left off. As biblical scholar Bart Ehrman says, it is not difficult to see how the mistake was made. The scribe copied the words before the angels of God in verse 8, and when his eye returned to the page, he picked up the same words in verse 9, and assumed those were the words he just copied. And so he proceeded to copy verse 10, leaving out verse 9 altogether. You can find hundreds of similar errors and mistakes like these throughout the text that survive to us today. But other changes, as we will discuss in a second, appear to have not been mere mistakes, but intentional and motivated alterations to the text. In some versions, verses, words, or entire passages have been added, subtracted, or changed beyond recognition. Scholars, both Christian, Jewish, agnostic, and atheist, often agree and recognize the evidence for such intentional changes. There are also other examples where the Greek text has said one thing, but later translators rendering the text into a different language have simply made their own versions of what the text should say to solve perceived contradictions. Other additions are just that, wholly new additions that weren't part of the text at all. I will spend the rest of this video featuring a few of these reported changes and the histories and context associated with them. Goliath's height. The battle between the young King David and the giant Philistine Goliath in the Old Testament book of Samuel is well known and perhaps needs no introduction. The encounter is often depicted in cartoons and children's books, a tiny boy up against a colossus. The giant, as described in the English Bibles used in churches today in 1 Samuel Chapter 17, verse 4, reads like this: "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span." This height would by modern estimates be a little less than 10 feet tall, towering over the tallest recorded man ever, Robert Wadlow. As stated before, this height originates in the Masoretic text, or MT, written around the late 1st millennium AD. However, all the oldest copies of this book and verse, such as the Septuagint, and notably the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st century BC, render Goliath's height as a much shorter 4 cubits and a span, or 6 feet 9 inches, a more historically plausible and realistic height when compared to the other reading. This shorter Goliath is also confirmed by other historical non-biblical texts, such as the writings of the historian Josephus in the 1st century AD. It seems like the older 4 cubits and a span reading was the original text of Samuel, as opposed to the 6 cubits and a span reading. Christian scholar and Professor J. Daniel Hayes agrees with this assessment and argues for reducing Goliath's height in modern Bibles. The motivation for this change seems likely to have been that of a tall tale, literally in this case. Later scribes perhaps wanting to make David's achievement of slaying a formidable opponent even more impressive, just as a fisherman is prone to exaggerate the length of his catch in retellings of his story. Over time, Goliath went from an abnormally, but yet plausible height to a monster out of mythology and legend. Number 9. Gospel titles and authors. The titles and authors given in the Gospels of the New Testament read in most Bibles in large, bold text: the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of John. We as readers are led to assume, and some Bibles outright state, that these books were written by Jesus' disciples and direct eyewitnesses to the events they describe. Matthew being written by, Jesus' disciple Matthew, the former tax collector. John written by John, son of Zebedee, and in the case of Mark, a man connected with Peter, and Luke, named after a traveling companion mentioned by Paul in Colossians. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. As confirmed by early manuscripts of the documents themselves, originally these Gospels were untitled and did not name any sort of author. They were written anonymously, and the authors, whoever they might have been, never wrote their names, nor did they write in the first person or insert themselves into the narratives. This was no secret, or even something that interested early Christians. It was likely assumed at the time that these texts were not written by the disciples or by anyone who had significance in Jesus' life. It's actually quite obvious that the disciples hadn't written these texts when one notes that they were written in Greek by educated Greek speakers, likely outside of Israel, maybe from Greece, Asia Minor, or Egypt. Literacy in the ancient world was rare. By modern estimates, at the best of times in antiquity, only about 10% or so of the population was able to read, and most of these were concentrated in urban areas like cities, and not in the type of areas where Jesus' disciples might have been from. Keep in mind, most of them were fishermen and hard laborers in the countryside, by all accounts, peasants. The ability to read is one thing. In the ancient world, it was another to be able to write and compose a literary work. Few people in the 1st and 2nd centuries would have been able to produce something like the Gospels. The few there were would have been from eastern cities of the Roman Empire, like Alexandria. Most scholars agree that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, and more likely to have been written by urban Christians who were recording oral and written traditions, sayings, and stories about Jesus and his life, passed down, and compiling them in a unified text. The Gospels themselves are not apologetic about this. The Gospel of Matthew is written completely in the third person, using they to refer to the disciples, and never we. The tax collector turned disciple Matthew is never referred to as me, but instead just him. There is zero indication in the actual text that we are supposed to be led to believe this man also wrote what we are currently reading. Same thing with Luke and Mark. The author of the Gospel of John clearly makes a distinction between himself and his informant, an unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved, who was the source of the stories and traditions he is writing down at the end of the Gospel. The end of the Gospel of John reads like this: Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the disciple who has testified to these things and has written them. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. The anonymous author is simply stating he gathered this information for this text from an eyewitness of Jesus, and that he had not met Jesus himself. The author dictated the gospel from this individual, whoever they might have been. It was only traditions made decades after the construction that tried to tie names to these untitled and anonymous texts, and the names just stuck even though there is no factual or textual basis for them, and the texts themselves explicitly argue against it. To early Christians, it didn't matter to them who the authors of these texts were. However, later Christians wanted to bring more authenticity to the documents by making their authors direct eyewitnesses to the events they described. They would essentially take names that are mentioned in the New Testament and say, yeah, that guy wrote this, with no corroborating evidence. The tradition in our modern Bibles of providing names and authors to the Gospels is just not accurate to the original text. I will continue to refer to these as Mark, Luke, etc. for the sake of brevity. Number 8. Women omitted. It may be a surprise to learn that one of the major divisions in early Christianity was that of the role of women in the church. We know from historical records and Christian writings that certain sects believed women should have a larger involvement in the church, while other sects were more sexist, often limiting women's rights and capabilities within the confines of the religion, for instance, preventing women to read or teach. Scribes belonging to these two sects clashed sometimes over the translations of certain verses. For example, in Romans 16, Paul lists several names and greetings to fellow Christians of the day. In verse 7 he writes, "Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me." Paul names Andronicus, a male name, and Junia, a female name, suggesting they are husband and wife to one another as foremost among the apostles. It is notable as it outright states women can become apostles, and notably church leaders. This would support the pro-women sects. Some later translators, however, rendered Junia as Junias, a masculine name, and Andronicus no longer as her husband, but as a traveling companion, just two bros, supporting the sexist sects. Ooh, try saying that a lot of times. This is strange, as although Junia was a very common name for a woman back in those days. There is absolutely no evidence in the ancient world for the name as Junias, for a dude's name. It is very clear Paul was referring to a woman in this text and acknowledging her as an apostle, but still to this day, some Bibles continue to refer to Junia as a man rather than a woman. Some other manuscripts have tried to circumvent this possible pro-women leanings in other ways, rendering Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me, as Salute Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, and also greet my fellow prisoners who are foremost among the apostles. In this version, a woman is again no longer an apostle, but merely a relative of Paul, changing the whole meaning of the text. There are dozens of other minor changes just like these that seem to have been made to reduce the role of women in the early Christian church. Prominent women become in some versions the wives of prominent men. Instances where the wife was named before the husband were reversed in others, Priscilla and Aquila to Aquila and Priscilla. Minor and petty changes many of these may be, they reflect a movement by scribes to reduce or increase the role of women in the early church, and illustrate a textual battle of sorts, and we can still see this in the early copies of the Bible that survive to us today. Number 7. Forgiveness on the cross. The Gospel of Luke recounts Jesus' crucifixion in Jerusalem. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with criminals, on his right and on the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Jesus' prayer, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing, is often seen as an illustration of Jesus' compassion and kindness towards those who are killing him, displaying forgiveness where most would seek vengeance. It's a very nice quote, and personally one of my favorites. However, this line curiously is missing in some of the older manuscripts of Luke. The earliest Greek copy, Papyrus P75, dated to about 200 AD, as well as a few other later texts, completely lacks the prayer of forgiveness, reading like this: When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals on his right, the other on his left. They divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. But the prayer exists in other copies, such as the Codex Sinaiticus. So this raises the question, was the prayer originally in the Gospel and then removed in some versions? Or was it not originally in the Gospel and then added later in some versions?